Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let's try that again. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. We want to let Father Tom next door know that we're here, just in case he thinks he's the only one doing something on this floor.
Right.
It's really great to be with you, to be back here at the Reno Diocesan Conference. This is my third year, and I'm super excited. I look forward to this every year. I talk about this conference all over the country. There are very few dioceses that have what you have here and have it as successful. And so it's just really awesome. I mean, everybody knows about the Los Angeles diocesan, but then once you get from there, there's only Reno. That's the only thing in my opinion. Don't tell anybody in San Antonio about that. I was at their conference last fall. They're doing a good job too, but they're no Reno. It's a joy to be with you. For those who don't know me, my name is Dan Horan. As you can tell from my very fashionable outfit, I am a Franciscan friar. I am not a come-to-life bird bath statue. I oftentimes, I pose for the statue. I don't really. I live in Chicago, and my primary ministry is as a teacher. I teach at the Catholic Theological Union. We have, in the exhibit hall, you may have seen the little booth there. It's a graduate school of theology and ministry, where you might think of us as a seminary, although a seminary usually just trains seminarians, people for ordained ministry in the church. We prepare religious and laity, men and women, for ministry in the church and for theological education, so people who are getting master's degrees or doctoral degrees in theology. And it's a wonderful ministry. If you're interested in theology, there are some distance programs. Come to Chicago. It's a great city, I promise, despite what people might tell you otherwise. I love it. The weather's a little bit colder right now than it is here in Reno, so that's something to consider. In any event, it's a joy, as I mentioned, to be with you, and the theme for our very dangerously timed space, which is 1 o'clock right after lunch on a Friday afternoon in a dimly lit hotel ballroom space. If you feel like you need to do some vertical meditation, which means closing your eyes and sleeping, I won't be offended. I'm only offended if you start throwing things like this gentleman up here has threatened to do. Throw some tomatoes. No, just teasing. Oh, I'll see. You have to be prepared if you're here. So the theme, though, for our workshop, for our discussion, our presentation this afternoon is social media engagement. Now, on the one hand, this is something people are talking about all the time. It's a reality that we all are kind of situated in, and it gets more and more precarious, more and more unthinking, right? We do this, we're glued to our phones, to our laptops, to our iPads and iPods. I don't know if they even make iPods anymore. I don't know what the latest thing is. You might have some Google Glass on. Does that still exist? Whatever your technology is on your watch, or in your pocket, or in your purse, we all are drawn into this. It used to be all the millennials, or the young kids, and the Gen Z, they're the ones. That's not true anymore. Quick, very embarrassing story on behalf of my mother that I'll share right now. Some years ago, I ended up in the hospital. Don't worry, it turned out fine, I'm still here. But I collapsed during a road race, and the doctors weren't sure what was going on. I was much, much younger back then. This was about 11 years ago. And so they thought there might be a heart issue or something like that. And so it seemed like it could be serious or it could be nothing. They kept me overnight. Well, the next morning, I'm in the hospital bed, and my parents, well, my mother is there, at least, and my brother was there. And the cardiologist comes in to give the report. Here's what we found, here's what's going on, et cetera, et cetera. And the first thing my mom does is whip out her cell phone and start typing away. And this cardiologist is like giving us important information, this is what we found, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, Mom, what are you doing? She's like, I want to tell your dad what he's saying. I'm like, maybe you should put the phone away and pay attention first, and then communicate. And so, it's not just the young people, that's my point. I'm even worse than she is. I probably would have been texting faster than she was. I wasn't in the hospital, one-handed. So the question is, as women and men of faith, as people of faith, what role does social media play in our faith life? And maybe more importantly, and something I'm interested in exploring today, what role does our faith play in how we engage in social media? And as a Franciscan, I think the Franciscan tradition offers us some insight, some ways to think about this, to think about our faith, our spirituality, and the way we go about communicating in this hyper-digital world. Does that sound good to everybody? It doesn't matter, we're doing it anyway. So here are the three things I want to talk about. I think from a Franciscan perspective, Franciscan theology and spirituality, from our history, there are three things we can take away. One is what I'm calling a positive exhortation, a kind of encouragement, a go for it, social media engagement, all in. But I also think the Franciscan tradition, Franciscan spirituality that arises from St. Francis and St. Clare of Assisi and their followers, also provides a cautionary tale that says, well, wait a minute, maybe we need to think through this a little bit more. And then finally, I think that there's a challenge that we as Christians need to take seriously when looking at the digital world and looking at our engagement with social media. And so I want to look at all three of these, and whatever time we have left, and if anybody's still awake and not napping, then we'll have some Q&A, some discussion. So first, this is, by the way, the 3 workshops I'm giving this weekend, I have to admit, this is my favorite series of slides that I put together. What does this relationship between technology and our spirituality, or technology and theology, what relationship is there, if anything at all? The question might be, as I just posed a moment ago, as Christians, should we engage? There is this tradition in Christianity, an ancient one, in fact, that goes back to the 3rd and 4th century, to the early generations of Christians, of fleeing the world. The Latin was called fuga mundi. Sounds like a swear word, doesn't it? Or like some sort of Italian cookbook, a fuga mundi. It is kind of a swear word. It's fleeing the world. It's escaping. It's saying that the world is a bad place, that the city is not a good place, that we need to go out into the desert, and where we find God is by being by ourselves, alone, disconnected. And so there might be a temptation in Christianity to say, whoa, should we engage in the first place? Wouldn't it be better, and there are some days, let's be honest, for our own peace of mind and maybe for the whole community, whether it's local or national or global, for us or for certain people to disconnect. Nevertheless, today, as I mentioned earlier, it's almost a ridiculous question. We are so integrated into our technology that we really almost can't disconnect. I'm reminded of the fact that now Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, that's a mouthful, I'll just call him B16. When he was Bishop of Rome and he was Pope, he, on the occasion of World Communications Day in 2009, talked about Christianity, living the gospel, and engaging in the internet, and at that point, early social media. And he coined this term. He called the internet the digital continent. And he said that this digital continent, it's not a physical space, but it's a real place where women and men, particularly younger women and men, spend increasingly large amounts of their life. And if we are, as Christians, sent out by Christ into the world to preach the gospel, by both our words, what we say, and how we live, then why shouldn't we also be present on this digital continent? If we don't bring the gospel to this space, then will it ever be there? Who's going to speak for the Christian message? And so he encourages us. Subsequently, Pope Francis has done similar things. He's been very encouraging when it comes to engaging in technology. He became, the first pope to, on a monthly basis, put out a papal video. You've probably seen it on YouTube, where each month it's not just a press release or just an article about what the Holy Father's prayer intention is, but he asks for the whole church throughout the world to focus their prayers on a particular theme, whether it's refugees and migrants, or whether it's young people, or whether it's couples, whatever it may be. And he makes a video. It's like a 3 or 4 minute video that gets released monthly. If you haven't checked that out, check it out. So the question isn't really at this point, as Christians, should we engage? The question is really, how do we go about doing it? A couple years ago, there was a New York Times article, and it already shows kind of how outdated it is. This is about a 6-year-old article at this point. The headline was, "Facebook page for Jesus with highly active fans." And there's this insight that the reporter points out. She says, Facebook and other social media tools have changed the way people communicate, have changed the way people work, the way people find each other and fall in love. While it's too early to say that social media have transformed the way people practice religion, the number of people discussing faith on Facebook has significantly increased. And you see here, this is an app created by the Franciscan order, a prayer app. There are many such things, right? There are apps now that allow you to pray the liturgy of the hours, right? The office of the church. There are missal apps where you can get the readings. I saw down in the lobby free copies of Give Us This Day, which is a great daily companion. It has the readings for Mass, it has a reflection. I contribute to that, so if you're not sick of hearing from me after this session, then you can go look up a reflection here or there. But the point is they have not only the paper edition, they have an app as well. There are apps that help people do an examination of conscience before going into the sacrament of penance, right, to confession. There's so many ways that we see this play out already. I think that the Franciscan tradition allows us to think about how we engage, recognizing that religion is inescapably going to be tied to social media technology. And so I mentioned those three things earlier. Here's kind of a more technical way of fleshing that out, pun intended on the third. The first is that in the Franciscan tradition, there's a deeply rooted evangelical and missionary vocation. By evangelical, I simply mean gospel-based. That's what the word evangelical means. I don't mean certain Christian denominations. I'm talking about anyone who believes in the gospel is evangelical, literally. But missionary as well, I mentioned a moment ago. Christ sends his disciples out, right, 2 by 2 throughout the whole world. In baptism, we too are sent out on mission. The second point is the Franciscan tradition has this strong renunciation of power. I'll say more about that in a minute. But that, I think, gives us pause as we start thinking about how do we tweet, how are we on Facebook, how do we comment on websites, et cetera, et cetera. How is the time that we spend? And then finally, for the Franciscan tradition, though it's not unique to Franciscans and Franciscan spirituality, it's very Christian at its core, right? There is this focus, this central focus on the incarnation, as well as the blessing of embodiment. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But let's start with this first one. Say a little bit about Francis of Assisi. He discovered this evangelical and missionary vocation slowly over time. I think it's easy for us at times to think about saints as having like these immediate conversion experiences, right? Pick your saint, pick your situation. You know, think it's like the way that St. Paul is often depicted, right? In the Acts of the Apostles, he's walking on the road to Damascus, and then boom, as if he's struck by lightning, Jesus is like, stop persecuting me. And Paul's like, okay, fine. I'm going to change my name to Paul. I used to be Saul. It's over. Now I'm different. You know? And the truth is, that's not how it really works. That's not how any of us experience it. Life, a lifelong experience of conversion is what the Christian life of discipleship is all about. It's true with Francis of Assisi. In fact, he writes at the end of his life, he's laying on his deathbed. He dictates what he calls his final testament. It's kind of his remembrances of what were important to him throughout his own experience of Christian living. He dictates this to his brother friars who write it down, and the way he begins is by saying that God has called him into this way of living the gospel, into what will become this Franciscan tradition. And he said that the Most High revealed to me that I should live according to the pattern of the Holy Gospel. It's interesting, the lines right before that, he says, nobody showed me what to do. I love that, because he wasn't somebody who went out with a plan. Francis of Assisi, his whole life was one of trying to figure out what God wanted for him. He struggled day in and day out to make sense of that. And at the very end of his life, he realized it was God who showed him. And what he was meant to do was live according to the Holy Gospel. What he comes to discover in time is that you can't live the gospel by yourself. As I'm fond of saying, there's no such thing as independent contractor Christians, no sole proprietor Christians, no rogue or soloist Christians. We do it in community. We're always together. We're baptized into a faith tradition, into a community, into the body of Christ, into the church. And therefore, if we're serious about living the gospel, then we have to be serious about being in relationship with others. Case in point, Jesus Christ. Right? God so loved us, St. Francis will say, and those who follow him will affirm, that God didn't just send his only son, the word didn't just become flesh to clean up our mess. Like we screwed up. Oh, Adam and Eve ate some fruit. Oh, geez, Jesus, take care of this. I think a lot of people think of Christianity that way. Makes for a very lame Christmas song, doesn't it? All of our Christmas songs are so happy, you know. Oh, little town of Bethlehem. You never hear that song, like, when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, God got really sad. He sent his only son at us because he was so mad. The fact that God enters the world as one of us is to show how close God wants to be in relationship to us. He gives up everything to draw near to us. And so Francis of Assisi is inspired by this and realizes that if he's going to live his way of life like Jesus, like the gospel, then he can't just kind of plop down in a monastery or in a rectory or out in the forest or into the desert, but rather he'd have to go where the people are. That's what itinerancy means. You're constantly on the move. Think of the way that Jesus lived his life. He didn't really have a home base. He had sort of regions that he stayed in, but he would kind of go out to where people were, right? And constantly travel and draw near to people. So Francis of Assisi realized this in time, that he embraced this kind of Jesus-like, evangelical, gospel-like way of living that meant he had to be in relationship with all people and eventually all of creation. And so that's really important. That's really at the core. That orientation of Franciscan life that I've been talking about, that following in the footprints of Jesus, living the way that Jesus did, is in our own time, not like photocopying Jesus. Francis of Assisi didn't wake up in the morning and go, what would Jesus do? I know, speak Aramaic and go blah, 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 to somebody else. You know? He wasn't kind of being a pseudo-Jesus. He was like, okay, how do I live like him today? In the early years of the Franciscan movement, there was this desire of the brothers to go beyond the local communities. This was a movement that started, a religious order that started in Italy, but very quickly they were going into all sorts of other places, into northern and eastern Europe, crossing what's now the English Channel into England. When the Europeans explored westward, right, to what we call now the Americas, to Central America, South America, and North America, the Franciscans were with them. If you look at the western coast of the United States, it was Franciscan missionaries, Junipero Serra and company, that formed what is now basically the state of California, and Oregon, and Washington. Ever notice how all the major cities in the west and southwest of the United States are Franciscan names? St. Anthony, San Antonio, San Francisco, that one's pretty obvious. San Damiano, you get San Diego, you got St. James, you get so many others. Santa Clara, and so on and so on. But there are some examples of Francis's own outreach, of drawing near to people, kind of taking a risk, crossing over borders that weren't typically crossed. One example is what happened in April of 1219. So this April, we'll be celebrating the 800th anniversary of this, where Francis of Assisi and a couple other friars traveled from Italy down to the battle line of the Fifth Crusade. And they engaged, they crossed over the battle line to have a peaceful engagement, conversation with the leaders of the Muslim camp, right? Sultan Malik al-Khamil. And it's amazing. He was there, as scholars tell us, for about 2 weeks, talking about faith, talking about religion, talking about the one God in which they both believe, but how as Christians we understand the Trinity, and learning more about the practices of prayer and the traditions of Islam. And what's most miraculous is that Francis and his Franciscan companions walked right out. They weren't murdered, they weren't martyred. And that was a sign, a very clear sign, of the fact that they were respectful and peaceful. And so this was something that was totally, to say the word countercultural is an understatement, totally insane in the 1200s. Particularly because this crusade was going on, this war was going on, in which all of Christian Europe was supposed to be behind fighting the so-called enemy. And Francis saw, his Muslim sisters and brothers not as enemy, but as sister and brother. So that's one way that he took real risks to reach out to others. You see also his embrace of lepers and other social outcasts and outcasts in the church. If I had more time, I could get into the significance of that. But again, like the experience in Egypt, it wasn't just not cool to talk with lepers. It was prohibited by church law and by civil law. And yet Francis went and lived among them. His refusal then of the cloister, staying locked in, right, of a monastery, of property, of that security of traditional religious life like you see in abbeys and in monasteries and rectories. His desire to let nothing get in the way of relationship with other people. At the core of all of that is this idea of humble service, that the way you go about interacting and relating to others, to women and men that you meet, isn't by saying, I have all the answers. Let me tell you. You need to say this prayer. You need to do that. You need to read this book in the Bible. You need to listen to me. I say jump, you say how high. Just kidding. You don't say anything. You just jump. Just making sure people are still awake. He was very concerned not so much about what people did. He was much, much more concerned about how they did it. And this becomes really important as we start thinking about our own lives. It's interesting that the Franciscans, we're a weird order, not just because we wear a weird old 800-year-old dress, and because we're goofballs like me, but we're weird because in our rule, our way of life, there's no specific ministry, no specific job that we are established to do. So Benedictines, right, they're established to pray and to work, ora et labora. They live in monasteries. They commit to staying in one place for the whole of their life. Jesuits, right, they were founded to be both a missionary society and educators. The Dominicans were founded to combat heresy around the same time the Franciscans show up on the scene. They were teachers. Their motto is Veritas. Long before Harvard existed, their motto was truth. We Franciscans, in our group, Francis doesn't say anything about what we're supposed to do. Are we supposed to be parish priests? Are we supposed to be educators? Are we supposed to be missionaries? Are we supposed to be teachers? Are we supposed to be working in soup kitchens? Are we supposed to be popular preachers, retreat directors, diocesan conference speakers in Reno? What are we supposed to do? He doesn't give any answer. He simply says in chapter 5, and the brothers are to work. For him, it wasn't so important what we did in terms of work or ministry, but how we did it. He put two conditions, though, on the work thing. The first one was that it shouldn't extinguish what he called the spirit of prayer and devotion. So if you become a workaholic and you're not praying like you ought to, and you're not participating in community life like you ought to, then you got a problem. That's maybe not the right job, the right ministry. The second thing he said is you can't do anything that's inherently sinful. So imagine that conversation as vocation director. And there, some guy shows up, and he says, oh, Father Dan, I'm thinking about being a Franciscan. Oh, that's great. What are you interested in doing? Oh, I've got a couple different ideas for ministry. I know the Franciscans can do lots of different things. I'm not really into parish ministry. And vocation director's like, okay, yeah, all right, that's okay. Not all friars are parish priests. I'm not really interested in education. I don't think I want to teach in a high school or in a college or something. That's okay. What do you have in mind? He says, Father, let me tell you. This is what I have in vision. First Franciscan assassin. Very James Bond, No one will ever see me. I'll be walking around in my habit. Very easy to conceal, weapons or whatever, maybe, a ninja star or something like this. And then I'll just go back and pretend I'm praying again. No one will see me coming. That's not okay. That violates rule number 2. And you can use your imagination about all the other things that might not fit into it. But that's a pretty small collection of things. Things that are inherently sinful and things that get in the way of your prayer life, your community life, your vocation. And so, we have all sorts of different things. Francis was concerned more with how you go about doing the ministry. And so there were creative ministries that surfaced very early on, working in hospices and in medical ministry. In schools, at the universities of Paris and Oxford, in popular preaching, going around in just what we today call parish missions, right? Back then, they didn't have parish missions. It would just be like showing up on the street corner, right? Hanging out in front of the Nugget in Reno, just like preaching the gospel. Lots of interesting stuff. We see that even in our own day, there are a lot of innovative Franciscan ministries. I think, for instance, of the Friars of the Atonement, who are ecumenical ministers. They work toward unity of all the different Christian churches. I think of the interreligious dialogue. So ever since Francis went to the Holy Land in 1219, Franciscans have staffed the Christian sites in the Holy Land. How many people have been to the Holy Land before? Notice a lot of guys walking around looking like this? That's not accidental, right? It's because of the Franciscan commitment to interreligious and ecumenical dialogue. I think about the direct service to the poor and to the marginalized, in very creative ways, in very risky ways. In the 1980s, particularly in places like New York City, some of the earliest and at times only ministries for people with HIV/AIDS were done by Franciscans, Franciscan sisters, Franciscan brothers, secular Franciscans. Think about missionary work abroad and so forth. So the question is, what about technology? This guy on the right is a friar from my province. He was texting when I was speaking one day, so he took a picture. I'm just kidding. I think what we have is an opportunity from this vantage point. Today, the internet and social media platforms offer a new opportunity for evangelization, outreach, and missionary activity. It fits right well with that Franciscan spirit of trying to live like Jesus, of going out into the world. Pope Benedict, he talked about this need to evangelize the internet. I mentioned already that he called this a digital continent, a kind of new world where we could bring the gospel. He says, too, that we must discover new possibilities for carrying out our ministry to and for the Word of God. And that tradition's been carried on by people like his successor, Pope Francis, the current Bishop of Rome, right? Pope Francis says, a culture of encounter, something he's always talking about. A culture of encounter demands that we be ready not only to give, but also to receive, right? Engage with one another. And media can help us greatly in this, especially nowadays when the networks of human communication have made unprecedented advances. The internet, in particular, offers immense possibilities for encounter and solidarity. This is something truly good, a gift from God. That's a pretty good endorsement. I wonder if that's on Apple's homepage. Again, he says, the internet can offer magnificent opportunities for evangelization if used with confidence and clear awareness of its strengths and its weaknesses. So something both Pope Francis and Pope Emeritus Benedict have said over the last now 15 years or so of their two ministries was that technology is neither entirely good nor entirely bad. It is good in the sense that it's a gift of human ingenuity and creativity and intelligence. We should be proud of the fact that we can do such marvelous things. But it can be bad too because it can be used for such ill. Nevertheless, we have at least what I would call an initial green light, and that the Franciscan spiritual tradition is right on board with this. That there's something to be said about living out this missionary, this evangelical call, following in the footprints of Jesus, going out to all people into new places and engaging in social media and the internet to do that. So we have a green light, but that's not all. One of the things that the Franciscan tradition also has as kind of a central theme is what I would call a renunciation of power. You've probably seen this too. Well, I'm just mindful of the time. If we have time in the discussion Q&A, I'll come back to it. As I mentioned, the previous element of the tradition really focused on why Christians should engage social media. It's a digital content. It's a new place, right? It's where people spend their time, right? This element, this renunciation power, is focused on the how we go about doing it. That the green light to engage social media, to be in the digital continent, isn't just, well, go for it any way you want. In addition to the lots of positives, right, the good things about social media, about technology, the connectivity, the potential for solidarity Pope Francis talked about, access to information, the opportunity for expression, the fact that people today could have a blog post or a video or a photograph that goes viral that would never have been heard or seen or recognized 20 years ago. So there's a lot of good potential there. Nevertheless, there are a lot of negatives as well. And this is important for us to keep in mind. Social media platforms have been the locus, have been the kind of center point of a lot of terrible things, including bullying, right? We see that publicly. And here I thought of the example, as I was thinking for today, of the actress